Alright, welcome back. DeFi House Strategies, and in this one I will be covering compounding liquidity pool positions when in DeFi. Okay, so this strategy will explain the compounding side of DeFi LPs, when to do it and when not to do it, and essentially why compounding works and why it is so powerful. Okay, so each time you harvest and reinvest the harvested fees, in other words, let's say you accumulated some fees from one of your LP position, when you claim them back to your wallet, you have multiple options what you want to be doing with those assets, right? So one way is to compound and get back to the pool. Okay, so each time you do that, your liquidity position size grows. Okay, and that extra liquidity earns more fees because your share of the pool increases. So over time, this creates a snowball effect. More liquidity means more fees then creates more liquidity, and then more liquidity eventually creates exponential curve to the upside. Okay, so compounding will not be felt within a first few days or even weeks, but it will be extremely felt after a few months. Okay, because that's when the curve goes exponential. So DeFi pools usually, as we all know, fluctuate in value and in ratios. Okay, and if you compound too often, for example, you do it on a regular basis as a habit instead of as strategical tool, you can be rebalancing your liquidity at a suboptimal prices, first of all, and you can cause yourself impermanent loss effect to lock in at the wrong moment, so to speak. Because when you claim the fees, right, you are claiming some sort of two assets in most cases, or if it's a farm and not a pool, you claim the reward asset, which is usually just one asset, right? One coin of a DEX or something. So if you rebalance, if you reinvest, and compound at a random time, just every few days, for example, without checking what's the current price and what's going to happen if I compound right now, you could end up with a worse situation than before. And just to give you a clear example, one of the ways that a person lost a lot of capital, not lost, but just effectively the value of the position got lower because the guy was deploying capital into a risky, very volatile pool. And because he was earning both assets, the volatile one and a stable coin, right? I believe it was a Zora USDC pool. And all the fees the guy earned, he was reinvesting back into the pool, essentially compounding it, right? And then what happened, even though the amount he generated from the fees was extremely high, right? Extremely high. But because he compounded everything, his position value increased, yes. But the Zora coin then experienced a massive drop, if I'm not mistaken, approximately 40% from the highs. Okay? Which means that all of those fees that he earned and re-added back to the pool essentially created this bigger position size. But because Zora went massively down, all of that, including all of the USDCs and all of the compounded assets, went down in value as well. And essentially he is like, I had this position for a month, I remember earning a lot of fees, but now I have way less than even I deposited because the value, of course, dropped, and he was constantly rebalancing the pool to stay in range, but he also rebalanced using 50-50 method and not 100% in Zora. So he was buying back Zora at the worst and worst and worst prices, always at a higher price, and then it dropped. Higher price, it dropped. Higher price, it dropped. And essentially, the impermanent loss just eaten everything alive because he was buying Zora at the wrong prices, right, to rebalance. And because he compounded all of his earnings back into the pool, he was buying from that as well. And as Zora goes down, down, and down, essentially you are left with even less money. So it's not always that you have to compound on every single DeFi position, right? It's a strategic thing, right? And I would never ever recommend compounding on a very volatile assets unless you really want exposure to them and you want to stack them for long-term perspective. But if your goal is to build cash flow and you want to increase your position size because the fees are high on this pool, for example, and that's why you are compounding, you can end up just becoming a bag holder and you will have to wait for a very long time, if ever, that coin to recover back to your original entry size. So compounding itself is not about compounding often, it's about compounding intelligently when you have to. Okay, so let's model a simple case with a very simple numbers just to keep the math easy. Okay, so let's say that we deposit 10k total in Sol USDC pool, whatever ratio it may be, doesn't matter. Let's say we used 50-50, okay, because you want to be building cash flow and you don't care about the ratio of the assets, you care about the value of the pool. Okay, so let's say you have 10k, let's say that current price of Solana is 180, and you pick a pretty small range, 150 to 210, okay, which is a pretty active range, just a typical all of the V3 style pools, okay, the concentrated ones. So let's say you picked this range, which is a pretty it's not the widest, but it's not too bad as well. So this range would be about 30%, 32 maybe percent depth, which is not too bad on Solana, right? It's pretty wide but not super wide range, so it's a pretty stable. And let's say that daily fee APR is about 0.25%, which is also reasonable with a medium volatility conditions. So your daily earnings is approximately $25 in fees. Okay, so when to compound and reinvest the fees based on this position. So the very general rule of thumb would be to compound when the reinvested amount can increase your LP position by at least 0.5 to 1% after fees. Okay, anything less is just not worth the transaction. Okay, and it just doesn't make much sense because each compounding should bring noticeable increase in position size. Okay, so for example, if your position is 10k, you should compound when you have approximately at least $100 in fees. You could do it with smaller amounts, but if you deploy less than 10k, it's not going to be noticeable. So if you deploy higher capital, let's say 50 to 100k into the pool, then even 0.5% will bring a fairly noticeable compounding effect. But as a general rule, I would say generate 1% in fees from your position size and then compound it. Okay, this ensures that the compounding meaningfully boosts your capital without wasting gas fees, without wasting those assets that you accumulated, etc. Okay, especially if you perform on a bit of a more expensive chains. This could be ERC20. That's the worst possible scenario, but some people still use it. So I just have to cover that, of course. But if you use Solana chain base chain, there is no problem. The gas fees are very, very minimal, right? But if you use Ethereum itself, or maybe Arbitrum at a peak liquidity and volume, it could increase the gas fees as well. So sometimes it may not be worth it even. Okay, so you might reach this $100 in fees every 4 to 6 days in a high volume Sol USDC pool, right? So every 4 to 6 days you generate about 1%, and then essentially you reinvest it back into the pool. Then it makes sense. Now, when not to compound? First of all, which is obvious, when the price left your range, your liquidity isn't earning the fee, so compounding now will not help you, okay? Instead, reposition your range first, rebalance everything, and you will be rebalancing with the higher amount anyway, because when you exit the pool, it will harvest all of the pending yield as well, unless you do that separately yourself manually. But usually if you are out of range and you want to rebalance, you will exit the liquidity pool, claim all the pending fees, and then reposition the pool with those fees included. You can do that, which will act as a compounding effect. Okay. Also, when the market is trending really hard, if for example Solana is skyrocketing, the USDC side might get drained. So adding back the fees, especially in USDC, right? Because you always earn in both assets, right? And if Solana is going up, you are converted towards USDC, right? So all of your fees that you generated, if you compound it back into the pool, especially the USDC side, if Solana is going up, could worsen your impermanent loss. This would not be a loss. I would like to call it opportunity cost, right? Because then keeping your assets in Solana, especially the fees part of Solana, would make much more sense, because that is also increasing in value. And if you redeploy back into the pool, right, then essentially, if what I'm trying to say is that, maybe I can draw it, or maybe let me explain it. If Solana price is going up and you are very close to your upper range limit, which means that you will be fully converted to USDC, right, at this point. And let's say that now you have pending fees generated of $200. Those $200 that you are pending are in 50-50 proportion, 50% in Solana and 50% in USDC. Okay, so even if your position is out of range, but you haven't claimed your fees into your wallet or compounded them, that 50% in Solana is still increasing in value, which essentially increases your pending fees value as well. But if you compound it at a wrong time when Solana is going up, right, and you are very close to your upper range limit, which means that you are mostly in USDC, the compounding transaction will sell your Solanas to USDC, because it needs to deposit in the same deposit ratio as you currently are. And if Sol is going up, you are very close to your upper range limit, you are mostly in USDC. So the moment you click on harvest and recompound, or if you use, let's say, VFAT or anything else like a position management that lets you compound, the moment you click on compound, it will sell your Solanas to USDC, add them back into the pool. Your position size will increase, of course, but then if Solana continues going up, you will get out of range fully in USDC, and that's the opportunity cost, because you had some exposure to Solana from the fees and now you lost it because you basically sold it by compounding back into the pool. That's what I'm trying to say. Also, you shouldn't compound when the fees are too small, because if you earn $5 of fees when you have 10K of liquidity, this transaction adds 0.05% to your position value. It's not worth the transaction. It's just not worth the effort to even do that, because 0.05% compound will not be noticeable for a very long time. Okay, so there is no point to do that. And even if you do that on a when the price of those assets are not favorable, it can even make the position worse. There is no point. So always compound at least 1%, 0.7 more or less, but 1% is very easy to calculate. So when you generate 1% in fees and your goal is to build this position size, build cash flow, right? And not to collect the fees and spend or reinvest somewhere else, then yeah, you generated 1%, you claim and re-add back to the pool. Okay, that will be noticeable, but not when you have 10k of liquidity deposited and every little dollar you generate you compounding, right? There is no point to do that. And lastly, when volatility is extreme as well, because frequent price swings can make your position inactive very quickly, and compounding too soon might waste your effort. The same thing as I explained on the market trending hard, which is, in other words, the volatility is high. In both cases, if it's going up or down, compounding at the wrong time can make your position worse. Yeah, because the same thing can happen from the opposite side. If Sol is melting and you are being converted more to Sol, then your pending fees value is also decreasing. So then you might actually want to do it quickly. You want to harvest the fee swap to USDC, get back to the pool, so those higher amount of USDC will accumulate Solana at a better prices, right? Which then makes sense. So you always have to be strategic. What kind of flow is gonna happen when you compound? Just read compounding transaction as a book. If I have 10k right now and $300 in pending fees, the current price of Solana is here. For example, it's going down. Okay, should I react quickly? What's gonna happen if I react now? If I react now, I will harvest the $300, okay, and I will get them back into the pool. And because Solana is going down, this might be a good thing because I'm locking it right now. So you claim the fees, swap to USDC right away, right? And if Solana is going down, let it go down a little bit more and then add USDCs back into the pool. It will sell your USDC to Solana, but you bought Solana at a little bit better price already if it's still going down, right? Just always read your compounding transaction, what's gonna happen with your money when you compound, because sometimes you will notice it does not make sense, or in other ways you will be like, okay, I have to do this quickly, but you can harvest the fees, swap to USDC the whole part of your fees and wait a bit, wait a minute or two, maybe an hour or so, depending on the market conditions, what Solana is doing, and then add, not immediately, right? Just always think strategically what's gonna happen and what is the best possible route to compound this position, okay? Those blind compounding when you just, okay, I woke up, it's Wednesday, let's see, okay, I generated a bit of fees, let me compound randomly without even thinking, will not work in a long-term perspective, because you could end up with a worse position if market decides to do one way or another. So it needs to be strategic, okay? Now, the exponential growth point, which is really, really important, you will notice that. Let's simulate it with a very simple numbers. Once again, the same ones. You start with 10k and your daily yield, let's say, just for this purpose, is 0.25% always, okay? So it's not going up, it's not going down, it's an average 0.25%. And let's say that you compound weekly. If you compound weekly with this yield, on day 0 you have 10k, after a month you have 10.774, after 90 days 180, and 365. As you can see, it starts to become exponential after about 3 to 4 months, more or less, and after half a year even, you have 50% more in your liquidity pool, right? So you are increasing the value exponentially. After a month, it's only $700 more or less. It's just the base average. But after half a year, it's already at 15k, and then after a year, it's 22k. So it's more than doubled in liquidity value just by compounding those effects. And moving forward, you are now yielding from 22k and not the 10k that you did in the first place. And if you did this with just 10k, always without compounding, there is no growth of your position size, right? You just claim the yield regularly and use it somewhere else, which is also a fairly decent strategy, but it all depends on your goals, right? What is your goal with this position? If you really like Solana, for example, and you are okay with being exposed to Solana on a regular basis, and there is no rush for you to generate the yield right now, okay, then you can always compound and just increase your position size because it will pay off in the future. If your goal is to generate cash flow right now, then of course compounding will not make much sense because you need the yield right now. But if you don't care about it, and if you are able to keep this position just growing, and instead of short-term pleasure, right, so to speak, focus on a long-term sustainability, then you can compound and increase your position value over time. And eventually, after a good few months, you will start noticing that you are generating much more in the future, right? Not right now. But if you need money right now, if this is your, let's say, if DeFi at the moment needs to pay for some of your expenses, it's better to deploy into liquidity pool, right? Whatever amount you operate with, and just claim the yields and use it on a strategic pattern as well. Maybe you want to compound 50% of the yield. Maybe you want to compound, maybe you just don't want to compound. Maybe you want to claim the yield, spend it, or claim the yield and open another riskier positions, maybe something like that. But this is purely to show you that keeping the same position and always compounding on a regular basis will give you an advantage in the future. So you may suffer a bit in the short term, but if you believe in those assets, if you believe in that pool, in those assets that you are deploying capital into, if you believe long term, then it just makes sense to compound and grow the position, because after a year you will be operating with much higher amounts. Simple as that. So you will be earning twice as much from the same deposit side only because you compound it, right? But if you compound every 3 days, for example, rather than weekly, as you can see, the difference is also pretty significant, because after a month you are not at 10.7, you are at 10.9k, and after a year you are not at a 22, you are at 24.4. So this adds 10% more in a year returns, purely from frequency optimization. Okay, compounding every week gives you one return. Compounding every 3 days gives you another returns, right? So you always have to optimize this, right? Because your yield is pretty high and stable, then compounding a bit more frequently, but not too frequent as well, will give you better results. But of course, these numbers are more or less, rough, because it's 0.25% flat. if it's not changing. You will get days when your daily yield will be 0.6%, and you will get days when your yield will be 0.11%, for example. So this is where that strategical part comes in play, when you have to think, should you wait a few more days and have a higher reinvestment amount, or should you compound right now because the position ratio is good enough for you or makes sense? So it's always strategic, not a random compound button and that's it. Okay, yes, even the most basic compounding will work, but it all depends on what asset you hold, because if you compound on stablecoin pair USDC USDT, then of course it's gonna always benefit you because you are always increasing the position size. But if you compound with the wrong assets and they become too volatile, eventually you might end up worse if you do it not strategically. Okay, so the exponential curve becomes visible after about 3 to 4 months if your APR is high and compounding is done smartly. So the first 2 to 3 months you will see tiny increases in position size and fees generated, and then later on that fourth month and beyond, the curve starts to go, like that. It's slowly increasing 3 months, and then it starts to increase exponentially. So this is the exponential curve, meaning that you will start noticing the returns dramatically faster. Because, for example, your returns, right? So you started with 10K and you were earning about $25 a day, right? After 6 months, you now have 16K, once again, and now you're generating about $40 on a regular day, on just a daily yield, okay, instead of 25. So you are always increasing this number, and then from this you go to 24, which is almost double from that, not double, but it's near, and you're generating even more, towards 55 to 60 dollars a day, rather than the original 10 after a year, if you're always compounding. And if you believe in that position, if that asset, it makes sense for you, right? Because you are increasing your returns always without you adding to the pool from the outside income. Simple as that. Now let me delete these few. Let's see a bit of a summary, and let me explain to you, because I'm pretty sure the top question for compounding will be, what if the position goes out of range? Okay, and I still want to keep it, I just want to rebalance it. How the compounding works in this way, which is the same way, it doesn't matter, because if you compound it and it went out of range, or you compounded and re-added pending fees while out of range, by rebalancing, you still increased the position size, even though the value of the pool can be lower because, let's say, Solana is dropping, but still the amounts of those assets are increased. So let's say that your deposit was 10K, okay? And after 3 weeks, you made 7% in fees, which is about 10.7 in total value. And let's say that you compound it and your new LP position is now 10.7K in range, okay? Let's say that the price drops 15%. So Solana is now down. Your liquidity moves out of range. So you now hold mostly in Solana worth, let's say, 9.2K. Okay, so you do have this impermanent loss. So you already had 10K, you generated 700, you compounded, and now it goes down. So by all means, yes, you have less value, right? Even so you compounded, but you rebalance this into the new range, so you have more Solana or USDC total quantity than you originally had. So your total USD value reflects the market price, but your compounding gains are still embedded. It's still valid. You accumulated more assets through the fees, and even if the market price fell, you now hold more units of both assets. The value can be lower, of course, momentarily while the market is doing what it needs to do. It's moving, right? But the quantities are increased anyways. So at the time of recovery, right, or with time, you are still generating more yield, so to speak, because the quantities are higher. The value might fluctuate at all times. So the last sentence, so to speak, from this perspective, even if your USD value temporarily dips due to market movement, your internal yield curve continues from a higher base, right? It doesn't matter what the price is doing, but if you claim the fees and reinvested them, you're still on point, right, for that growth curve, even though the price of Solana is going down, right? But if you're still reinvesting at certain periods right here, when the times come, right, you are still earning more and more because you are increasing the quantity of assets, not the value, yeah, but the quantity. The value is determined by the market price, but the quantity is determined by you, right? And if you are always harvesting and reinvesting at the right times, still the internal yield curve is going like that, right? Even if the price of the asset is going down. It's just the value might dip, but at the time when this thing starts to recover, this will stay the same, but the value will start increasing also exponentially because you've been doing and accumulating assets at the lower prices. But compounding effect is still valid even if the price of the asset is down and you are out of range rebalancing. If you rebalance with the fees including, you are essentially still compounding. Okay, so compounding is a very good method to grow your position value over time, but it needs to be done correctly and it needs to make sense for you, because maybe after a year you don't even want to have any exposure to Solana or something, but maybe you always want to have exposure to Bitcoin as an example. Then it would make more sense to deploy into the BTC pools, CBBTC USDC, for example, on base chain, right? And just always stack CBBTC and USDC and just compound, because you know that you are happy to have that position long-term perspective. Even after a year, you will increase your liquidity value, your quantities of both assets, you will increase them. The value will be determined by the market, of course, but you are always stacking more and more, and if they keep active in range, they are generating you more and more. Okay, so it's a very powerful tool to grow the position size, but it needs to be done strategically and not randomly. Okay, so thank you for watching this one. Hopefully it will be beneficial, and as always, I will see you on the next video.